what really is the explanation among the ordinary people that God had chosen them, and this God was not powerful enough to set them free, and they have to suffer all this while before they could finally free themselves, and they have to thank God for it. I'm trying to understand how we manage to explain this to the people so that they can understand it, that it is really the hand of God in what is happening to them.
Absolutely. And that is a very important question and actually sheds light on something that I think is definitely worthy of discussion, which is to say, right, did people actually believe this in their hearts? Or was this a kind of discursive strategy, right? So, what my book basically argues is that I think that both are true, right? I was able to examine, private correspondence, right, where people are conveying these kinds of thoughts about, God put, a shield between me and the soldiers that were between me and kept me from harm's way, right? Um, but then also, right, there are examples where there's a lot of skepticism, right, where people are like, well, how can the SPLA be, invoking God, right, and kind of framing themselves as a, suffering people at the hands of Muslims when they themselves are also perpetrating atrocities, right? Um, and the fact that South Sudan, since achieving independence in 2011, right, has been, well, from 2013 until 2018, was embroiled in its own civil conflict, right? Some people have been saying, well, were they really Christians to begin with, right? How can someone kind of, wear this, mantle of being, a chosen person, right? A kind of noble, chivalrous Christian, fighting to free people from oppression, right? And then once independence is achieved, become a corrupt politician, right? It's kind of tough to reconcile those two things. And so I think that you are right, in that there are people who arguably used the language of Christianity to kind of, justify their own personal political interests, right? And that is something to be pointed out and critiqued. But then there's also a long history, right, of people who truly did believe that, in a context of war and famine, slavery, right, um, sexual violence, right, that God was on their side in the midst of it all, right? And so there, I think, is a history of co-optation of Christianity for self-serving interests, but I think also an embracing of the faith as a kind of instrument to help people get through and to overcome in the midst of extraordinary difficulties.
Thank you very much for that. Another thing that I was also reflecting on in the book is the way you refer to South Sudanese intellectualize the term Judeo-Christian to propagate their war. I don't know, for people who have not read the book, if you want to say something there as to how they managed to create this image in the mind of the people. So I don't know if you want to further expatiate that part.
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the most exciting things that I argue in the book, right, is that um, the South Sudanese who were involved in kind of the project of religious nationalism were a very diverse lot, right? So, we're not just talking about kind of ordained clergy, right? But we're talking about soldiers, um, mission school students, right? Um, Newspaper contributors, right? People who are both schooled and people who, might not be necessarily theologically trained, right? But are still, using sources like the blogosphere, right? Facebook, Twitter, right? To kind of, disseminate their own views and interpretations of how scriptures, might shed light on contemporary circumstances, right? So practically speaking, I think one way to answer your question is in terms of, print sources that are circulating. So the SPLA, for example, had its own propaganda newspaper that was actually published out of Kenya, but was sent throughout the world, right, to places like Germany, the UK, the US, Australia, right? And in this propaganda newspaper, you would have certain poems that really spiritualized the conflict between Khartoum, right? Whether, you had Omar al-Bashir, right, described as, Satan, right? This one man out of Germany wrote this very long editorial in which he equates the Civil War with spiritual warfare, right? And so he looks to the writings of Paul to say, look, this is what spiritual warfare means in this context today, right? So print culture was huge, right, in this, but then we also know that there were kind of non-print ways, right? Whether it was soldiers in the 1960s, sewing crosses on their uniforms, right? Whether you had spears being blessed, right? A very famous Catholic priest, Saturnino Lahure, who is seen as really kind of like a saint-like figure today, actually takes up arms, right, as a priest to fight for the Southern cause and gets killed, right? Now, he's a very rare case, right? It's not that there's a long history of people of the cloth in South Sudan taking up arms, yet and still he is one very famous example of that, right?
Anyway, people don't ask a question. So what I'm going to ask you is, how much role does ignorance play in situations like this, where we use God to justify political moves? This is not only happening in Africa, they happen in many parts of the world.
Yeah, so, very good question. And to your point, a very timely one. And I think that, my US context, right, is a really kind of good example of how dangerous, right, ignorance can be in terms of people, appropriating God or Jesus into the political sphere. I think that the question can be answered in two ways, right? On one hand, absolutely, right? Throughout history, religion, whether it is, an Abrahamic faith or a non-Abrahamic faith, religion has been used to justify what most people would ordinarily call selfish, greedy, horrific things, right? The Crusades happened, right? Ethnic cleansings and genocides, all over the world, right, have happened, right? People used the curse of Ham, right, from the book of Genesis to justify the transatlantic slave trade, right? So on one hand, we know that there is a long history of people taking, creative license, if you will, taking scriptures out of context, right, to justify or explain away bad behavior, right? And so I do think that there is room to critique South Sudanese public officials who have, used, I'll say, a strategic hermeneutic, right? Not to point people to God, right? Or not to kind of, encourage a more, just society, right? But to exploit, right? There's absolutely room for that. But the reason why I'm hesitant to use that as the primary lens, right, is because books like mine show that you have people who have looked to God, right, in their ignorance, yes, to maybe understand what is really difficult to come to terms with, but also as a source of empowerment, right? And so, it's one thing if someone invokes God in a way to say, kill these people that you don't like because God told you to, you are chosen, they're not. And so therefore their lives are less, worthy, right? That obviously would be a misappropriation, and that there's lots of room to critique that type of invoking of God, right? But for the person whose, family has been killed, right? And they're on the run, fleeing from South Sudan to Uganda, right? If they are invoking God by saying, hey, this is my own kind of personal wilderness experience, but just like God was with his chosen people when they fled from Egypt to the promised land, God is with me too, and that Uganda is my proverbial promised land, and so I guess what my hope is, right, is that people walk away from my book not seeing the book as a kind of, not as a triumphant history, or one that kind of seeks to ignore the fact that, yeah, everybody in the book might have kind of different perspectives, right? But to see that it is a checkered history, right? It's not all people trying to exploit, but it's also not all ignorant people too, right? Like, you have really educated, smart people, right, who did go to, the best institutions and things, who are also using this language, And so how do we come to terms with the fact that both can be true at the same time, right? That those who are selfish and selfless are invoking the same God, right? And that the reality of one does not negate the reality of the other.